anyone who thinks that £30 million is going to make them any happier than £3 million is a complete idiot. The standard of human behaviour from a supermarket buyer is just hideous. Now, Sonny, when we whistle, you jump. The only question is how high. That was it. I told him to f*** off. And the interesting thing is that I actually met this bloke about 5 years later. He was working for another company, and he was a really nice bloke. It's just accepting you don't have to be perfect to love yourself. There were lots of things I wasn't good at, lots of people that I'd mistreated. But that doesn't mean that you have to loathe yourself for the rest of your life.
Who are the people you'd wronged? Guy, thank you so much for doing this, especially in your wonderful abode. I really appreciate it. Love everything you've built with Riverford. I think, and I've read a lot of your newsletters. I've consumed a lot of your videos over the last kind of week or so, and I think what we'll really explore today is this kind of new way of doing business with the sort of the collective, not having to kind of follow the status quo and do what every other brand is kind of blindly maybe following, which is that big exit. I think you are paving a new way of doing business. I'm excited to explore that with you today. But what I'd love to start with is there was one article I read which was brilliant called Leaders and Their Demons, where you talk about watching Succession. I don't even remember writing that.
I don't actually.
Well, let's start with that. And it's interesting because you talk about in the early days having, my demonic drive to overcome or destroy any barrier certainly helped Riverford up to a point. But since we became employee owned, I have come to appreciate that dispersed power and consultation lead to better, safer, less impulsive decisions, and they don't have to come at the price of bravery and responsiveness. And then you go into how, when you're not in this sort of neoliberalist or neoliberalism way of working, you can actually make better decisions, and that's what we're gonna pull out and tease out today. But I'd love to know, what were those demons in the early days that actually drove you forward, and then when you moved to an employee-owned business, how did those demons change? Yeah,
after quite a lot of introspection and a fair amount of therapy, I have reached the conclusion that my early adult life and my adolescence probably, I was driven by a need to prove myself, and probably mainly to prove myself to my father, and that was the main. So that's probably mainly, we're talking ego really, was driving me forward and leading me to work those ridiculous hours and sacrifice everything to be successful, and sometimes to push others aside in a way which, looking back, I have some regrets. And I know I was perceived as being, probably quite an aggressive, probably, and then undecently commercially successful in a sector which was characterized by people who were driven by their beliefs. I'm talking about being an organic grower here, people with an obsession with the soil and trying to improve the world by improving soils and so on. So that's what drove me forward, and I suppose through my 40s and 50s, I started to question that and realize that as a leader, you have responsibilities, and one of those responsibilities is actually to understand what it is that genuinely drives your behavior and your decisions, and to come to terms with that. So a lot of the entrepreneurs that I meet are deeply insecure people, and it's that insecure and need for approval which drives them forward. Now, they often, money becomes a proxy for approval, even a proxy for love, I think, which we all need. And it's a very unsatisfactory proxy, I think. If people just had the courage to actually sit down and examine what was driving their decisions and really come to terms with it, I think they'd make better decisions, they'd be less avaricious, and we'd live in a kinder, more sustainable world. So I do think that slightly unhinged drive of entrepreneurs, which we hold in such high esteem in the UK, and it can deliver wonderful things, but it can come at quite a high cost.
Do you think we could get the amazing businesses and that insatiable drive if founders weren't insecure?
It certainly seems to be the ones that are insecure that are most highly driven.
Yes.
So, and indeed, I remember my father, who did finally, very near the end, pulled me towards him in bed and said, "Son, you've done well." And, I just burst into tears because that's all I'd wanted him to say all my life. But I don't know whether it was because I finally felt I'd got his approval that I could then question what I was doing more broadly. But it leads to some pretty unhinged behaviours that I think can be. Yeah, I think certainly we can have better models for business than that, and it's the whole. It's all been captured by, I would say, by neoliberalism, where money is the proxy for everything. Money is the only thing that matters. I don't know whether Margaret Thatcher actually did say it, but society doesn't exist. That we're all just individuals, and that we all strive for our individual, largely commercial benefit. I think
Yeah,
sorry.
that's right. Yeah.
No, I'm not going to. I'll just still get off it. I'll just put it there. You won't hear it. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. So then, in your 40s, when you began to sort of analyse and pick apart those,
I probably should. Sorry to interrupt you, Dan. I probably should say I did, in my late 40s, have a sort of minor breakdown. It was very brief. I mean, I think I've always had depressive tendencies all my life, but I did around my marriage unwound, and I did find myself on my farm in France alone, living in my bus, which I used to take down there, which was very lovely, but and everything just fell apart. And for about a week, I just couldn't do anything. I couldn't make any decision. I was just, had a big wobbly bottom lip and didn't know whether I was coming or going. It all just, and that was a bit of an epiphany for me. And I got on my bicycle and cycled about 100 miles around the coast front. I got back late at night, and I'd gone through it, and I felt I'd found another me, and me that I was more sort of comfortable with, and I think probably a much gentler, kinder, more considerate me, and I sort of feel I had to go through that, and I think my approach to things have changed since then.
And so you're on this bicycle going around France. What are the sort of thoughts going through your head as your bike's spinning? What's spinning in your brain? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I think it was just trying to get the thoughts out of my head, actually, was what needed to happen. And I think through just complete physical exhaustion, I managed to sort of empty my head. And I did. I woke up the next day a different person. I mean, some people do ayahuasca.
Yeah, you're going to cycle around fucking France. Way of doing it. And what had changed in the guy, and what was what were some of the mental models that you'd held on to before, which was this insatiable drive to get your dad's approval? You have this sort of rock bottom, and you need to go to the bottom to go up. I have depressive episodes. I had one in the fucking summer where I had to go and see a therapist. Like, I think if you've got a naturally creative brain, it's just you can get into this. I think creativity is overthinking used positively, and overthinking used negatively is anxiety. So they're two sides of the same coin. Yeah. That's why all these
interesting
rock stars and stuff, they're the most creative people in the world. When they're doing something good with it, they're creating the best music in the world. When they're not, they're fucked up, and they're like, that's why we got the 27 Club. All those Amy Winehouse, Jimi Hendrix. I think it's a byproduct of creativity. What were the mental models that kind of changed post this cycling around France like a madman?
Yeah. It was. It's going to be like a therapy session.
Yeah, sorry, I was not. We're going to get onto animals and vegetables.
That's
and all
fine.
I wasn't ready to go here straight away. Sorry.
It was around. It was around accepting that you don't have to be perfect. You can be. It's okay to. Mess up. It's okay to get things wrong. It's okay to. Yeah, I think I beat myself up so much about the stuff that I got wrong and the people that I wronged. And it's okay, you want to change those behaviors so you don't wrong people as much or again, but it's just accepting you don't have to be perfect to love yourself. And so I think it is about learning a bit of self-love and acceptance, and that, for my mind, that came out of accepting that I wasn't perfect. There were lots of things I wasn't good at. There are lots of people that I'd mistreated, but that doesn't mean that you have to loathe yourself for the rest of your life. You can address those things. You can say sorry. You can go round and apologise, or even not apologise, but just try and behave better to the people. And
who are the people you'd wronged?
Siblings to some extent, probably most notably my children. I have had conversations, I think, with all of them around, I was pretty absent, particularly when my first two children were born. I was just obsessed with growing vegetables so, and then, I do try now when I get things wrong. Often I know when I've overstepped the mark. As a matter of fact, it happened last night.
What happened last night?
Last night, one of my neighbours, who I quite like, my wife drove down, a tree had come down, one of my trees, it had been cut up, and he was there loading it into the back of his transit van. So, I just saw, this is not the first time this has happened. I just saw red and I went round to the house and I behaved really badly. I just completely lost my rag in front of, his children, whatever. It was completely out of order. As it turned out, the guy who had cut up the tree said he could help himself to it. So I don't know why he said that, but that's what he said. So he hadn't done anything. Do you know what I mean? I'd just and in a previous life, that would have just stayed with me, and I would have been too proud to apologise, but I went back and apologised. And as a result, I could get to sleep that night. It's apologising when you get things, it's really not that hard. I think a lot of people, especially blokes, probably find it hard. But it's really not. And it's not a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of strength, and actually, you have to be genuine about it. I was very remorseful. I'd behaved badly and, I wanted to apologise. And I do the same in board meetings. I do sometimes lose my rag. I'll get quite impatient with the whole process of board meetings and so on. And I think sometimes I stir it up just to stop myself falling asleep sometimes. And sometimes it's
I call board meetings bored, as in BOARD. They're fucking boring as hell.
So when I get it wrong, apologising is quite a powerful thing. And as a matter of fact, it was my coach advised me that I should do this, that her words were to be gratuitously offensive less often, and when I am, to apologise publicly and quickly. And those were extraordinary, they were very powerful. It was a very powerful lesson. Actually, I only needed to be told it once, and I found it very easy to change. I'm not sure that other people would find it that. And it changed the whole atmosphere of the room. So at the time, we had a lot of quite macho, dick swinging
What year was this?
Young men. This was about 6 years ago.
Right.
So it was, I think I was well on my journey by then, so I just needed it to be pointed out that I was being a twat, and I recognised it, and it was quite easy to change. But that did change the whole, and it was noted actually around the business that instead of these blokes who went into the glass-lined room and, threw their weight around, it has become a much more, it was certainly, I think it was when we were on the journey to employee ownership, it has become a much more consultative and, inclusive and less macho. There are a lot more women in the room, which probably helps as well. And it has changed. I think we have a very functional board now, actually, that I am very proud of.
It's such a paradox, isn't it? Because on the one hand, to get the thing going, you need that sort of masochistic, demonic drive to push through obstacles, and you need the insecurity and the ego, because, if you don't have that, I think obstacles will come, and that's where that ability to lean into hard. But at some point, and as you say, you went through it at your 40s cycling around France, as you need to, that shit may get you from A to B. It's not going to get you from B to C to the future, is what we're talking about. And what I wanted to get to, which you've beautifully kind of detailed, is how we came to this sort of employee-owned, collective, very kind way of doing business, where everyone is treated well and everyone has ownership. I'd love to know, kind of, to get to that first, I'd love to sort of discuss neoliberalism, sort of defining that, from what my reading on it is, it's Margaret Thatcher and it's like the 80s, people smashing coke, making a fuckload of money in New York, and that sort of created this insatiable drive for more and greed. We kind of, before that, we had sort of the Summer of Love, the Beatles and all that shit. I don't understand. I'd love to sort of get kind of a quick history on how we got to this neoliberalist point of view, and I think where we are now is kind of an extension of that. And then that will set us up nicely for your new way of doing business, which is this sort of employee, collective-owned, kinder way of doing business.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a social historian or whatever, but neoliberalism largely, I think, came about with Reagan and Thatcher, didn't it? And is it Morgan Freeman, the economist, that they all... And it was... largely based on that, greed is good. That all we need to do is, if it allow individuals to get rich, and, I think there was a belief, and that we have to deregulate in order to do that, give them the freedom, to pursue their own economic interests, and out of that, wealth will be created. And I think it probably did create a certain amount of wealth, and maybe there was some regulation that needed to be dealt with. But, I just think it went way, way too far, and the idea that, everything can be measured in money and in particular sort of individual wealth, and that all we care for is striving for our individual wealth is just a lie. You just have to look around you and see how most people behave every day. Teachers, when they're doing a good class, are not thinking about, whether they're going to... how much value added they're going to add to that pupil. This is how they talk, and how that will be measured, and how that they will then be transferred into their salary and their promotion. This is the idea that we had, in healthcare, in our penal system, in education. It's just ridiculous when people go to work because they just want to do a good job. They go into those professions. A few people go into teaching because they like long holidays, but most people because they want to do a good job. Often they were inspired by a teacher at school and so on. And so to treat them in that, homus economicus or whatever, as if we are just units of production and consumption is I find it really, it's untrue, and I find it really, really offensive. I find it demeaning to me as a human being and to the people that I share this planet with. And I was in London last week, and there's often many things I'm horrified about London. And actually, we ate in some fancy restaurants and, spoke at a conference and so on. But what I realised, actually leaving London, what I enjoyed about London was actually public transport and shared spaces. I always loved going to the National Portrait Gallery, and the things that actually weren't a commercial transaction were the things that I really valued. And yet we sort of attribute no value to that through my adult lifetime, and I've ended up actually. I've been through anger. I'm feeling slightly like I want to withdraw from the world now because I just do not understand. I don't understand this behaviour. I don't understand why we are organising ourselves in a way which is so obviously a lie, and I'm pretty upset about it, actually. The richer those small number of people get, because everything's loaded to enable people like me to get even richer, the richer they get, the more influence they have, the more influence they can buy, through lobbying, affecting our governance, through advertising, affecting the way that we consume things and whatever. So these small minority of very wealthy, often fairly demented, sometimes sociopathic individuals are the ones that are shaping our society, and they are not the norm. And I find that I've lived my life in this way. I've been hoeing my way up and down rows of lettuces, thinking about how the world could be a better place. And I'm sorry, we just keep on moving in the wrong direction.
It's almost like the macro meta-narrative is this neoliberalism, more is more, greed is greed. It's almost, again, what we were saying before we hit record, it's like people aren't questioning that meta-narrative. That's why people people listening to this podcast is like, yeah, I'll exit the business because that's the right thing to do. That's what people have told me to do, and that's when I'll make shitloads of money, and that will give me money equals love. I love that point. But actually, if you think about it, this macro meta-narrative, but on the micro, which is sort of the day-to-day, is people are actually much kinder than what the world tells us. I think people pine for festivals. I know this is a bit of an oxymoron, but like a Glastonbury is a money-making machine. But like the whole idea of being at Glasgow and why people call it this almost utopia for a few days is because a lot of those constructs of greed and grind are completely, obviously a lot of people off their heads as well, but like that probably helps with the situation. But I think I think it's a really interesting thing of like this meta-narrative of greed is good, more is more, Wall Street, which has kind of spun into today. And I think you're right. It's the tube is, if you actually think about it, is such a collective way of being. There's a really interesting guy called Jonathan Hyatt, I think, who wrote a book. What was the book he wrote? He wrote The Righteous Mind, 2012. And he says humans are 90% chimp and 10% bee. And I think it's really interesting because, bees are collective, right, and chimps are kind of self-sufficient, or like kind of the ego. And I think it's an interesting place to play. I asked some fucking random questions, but what have being in nature with bees and ants? I suppose they're the collective animals. What has that taught you about human nature? And then on the other side, I'd say what animal best represents greed and neoliberalism, and what's that taught you?
Well, being in nature certainly has tempered my, individualistic, selfish inclinations. I think it's tempered them because it teaches you humility. I mean, especially if you're an organic farmer, stuff does go wrong. And you can't always, reach for a chemical container and find the solution. Stuff goes wrong. And sometimes it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be. And sometimes it self-corrects itself, and sometimes it is really awful, but you don't die. Things carry on, and that. So I suppose there's a sort of humility that came out of that. That I think nature can be a good teacher, and it's getting a bit intellectual, I think. But there is nature. There are lots of lessons you can learn. Like its strength lies in its diversity. I think we could learn a lot from that.
What do you mean by strength lies in its diversity?
It's an ecological principle that the more species you have in a habitat, the more stable it will be. And so if things change a little bit, like climate change, it will be able to respond better because one of those species will find itself in the...
Is that why cities are so... taking that ecological principle, is that why cities are so strong because they're so diverse? Like someone like New York, or is that me being a bit...
Oh, possibly.
I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Possibly. I mean, you see it around a boardroom table. I mean, strength comes from diversity. If everyone's the same around that table, you might make decisions very quickly, but you're going to make some pretty bad ones. So you need anyway. So I think diversity and strength from diversity and stability coming out of diversity is a pretty good principle. And I suppose sort of. You learn, said humility, but also sort of patience. You get a sort of time of the seasons and so on, and that you can't do everything instantly. You have to be learning from observation. I mean, as an organic farmer, you have to really immerse yourself in nature and understand the ecosystem that is your farm in order to manage it. And I don't think you're going to be a very successful farmer if you're not spending a fair amount of time just walking around observing things. And obviously, in particular, your crops and your livestock and how well they're doing, and then relating that back to decisions that you may have taken and observations that you're making around that. So that's, the idea that you can just sort of superimpose something in the place of nature, which I would say is largely how modern agriculture works. You're superimposing normally a monoculture, zero diversity.
So when you say superimposing a monoculture...
So you're taking a field, if you take lowland Britain, you take an oak forest, you clear it, you burn it, you plough it, and eventually you sow a field of wheat.
Yeah.
And you just got one, where you might have had hundreds of species, you just have one species. And that is a very unstable system. So aphids will arrive, they'll do quite well on that species. There'll be nothing there to eat them, and you'll have an outbreak of aphids. So then you have to reach for the insecticide. Weeds will arrive and they'll thrive in that, and then you have to reach for the herbicide. So you end up using all these inputs to maintain what is intrinsically a very unstable system. Whereas if you'd grown a crop that was actually a mixture of crops, as is sort of one of the principles, organic farming, and in particular permaculture, you'll have a more stable system. Or in our case, we have quite small fields surrounded by really abundant hedges, and which harbour a lot of the predators, which then go in the aphids in the field. So I haven't used an insecticide on the farm for 25 years. But that, if I had much bigger fields and a much less stable system, then I would be, I'd find farming much more difficult.
And what other principles have being in nature taught you about business? I think that's such an interesting crux to play with.
Well, I'll come back to humility. I do think, not thinking that you can control everything. I sit around the boardroom table, actually, and I listen to people talk as if we can control the behaviour of, our customers or what's going on in the bigger world. We're just a cork being buffeted along the stream, Or you can, yes, you can, to some extent, you can put out a few messages and try and influence the agenda, what people are talking about. But mostly you just have to, respond to what's going on. And, I think I am not a fan of spending ages coming up with a business plan. We do it. I mean, I have to understand that other people within the business need that structure, that I'm a pretty anarchic person, and I think I struggle with structure. And so my way is very sort of freewheeling, responsive, come up with lots of ideas, implement one every day, sort of thing. Whereas the plan that most businesses will be that they'll have a 3, 5, maybe a 10-year plan, and lay out what they're going to achieve, and then put in a strategy to deliver that, which definitely has its advantages. I definitely think you should know where you're heading and have a rough idea where you're getting there, but I would generally favour being more flexible in.
Yeah, it's like having a compass versus having a map. I think everyone wants a map, but actually if you just had a compass. And I think the humility point's very interesting. It's like, as you say, you could be walking along with the best map in the world or best business plan. Suddenly it fucking starts snowing or there's a thunderstorm. You realise that the map is not the terrain, is one of my favourite quotes. It's not, you could have the business plan, but it doesn't tell you what's going to be happening and the nuance and the speed bumps along the way. Yeah. And I think the being in the nature really kind of, it's beautiful doing this podcast here because we're literally kind of enveloped in nature. What sort of the learnings you've taken from moving to this collective? Is it collectivist business or collective business?
Are you talking, because we do, Riverford is employee owned.
Employee owned, yeah.
And then Badford, where we are now, we have a group of businesses which we do call the Badford Collective.
Right, I'm talking about Riverford.
Riverford.
So you've moved it to, because you gave away most of your wealth to the employees.
I sold the first 74% of the shares in Riverford to the then employees, now co-owners, for about a quarter of what the accountants told us it was worth. So, and many people thought that was an odd thing to do. I mean, some people thought it was a very generous thing to do. I think most people thought it was a bit strange. And a few people were outright offended by it. And
why did you do it?
I did it. Number of reasons. I wanted to leave the business in safe hands, where I'd witnessed a lot of other businesses that had been sold to venture capitalists and that had just been destroyed by, they were set up by founders who had a genuine enthusiasm for what they did. And I'm not saying, they wanted to make a return on their capital for sure, but they had an enthusiasm for whatever it was, making crisp vodka, the best chocolate, the best yogurt. And that was what really drove them. And they just had to run a business in order to be able to do that. And that was certainly how Riverford was set up. I did have this need to prove myself, but as it went on, I just got obsessed by growing vegetables, and I just wanted to do it well. And I always quote the famous drug dealer, Mr. Nice.
Is that the Welsh?
The Welsh guy.
Yeah.
He said, I never wanted to be a drug dealer. I just couldn't smoke it all myself.
Yeah.
So if I could have eaten all the vegetables myself, maybe that would have made me happy. And I'm losing myself here a bit, Dan. You're going to have to remind me what the question was.
No, it was... we were talking about that's a good point. I've sort of forgotten the thread we were on. So we were talking about how why you were doing the collective business, why you gave it to employees, and you were basically saying how you saw these brands. The founders, the weed, Mr. Nice saying, I've had to smoke it, I had to give it away because I couldn't smoke it all myself. And it's that, I agree, it's kind of, as we were saying, you need that insecurity and that drive to get the thing going. Yeah. But then you also need this, and I think most founders start with a genuine desire to create something good, and they're obsessed with that, and the business is sort of the byproduct of doing that.
I would agree with that, yeah.
And then you were saying, then the venture capitalist comes in sort of like a hungry lion and fucking rips it up and chews it up and spits it out, and then you're kind of left with your business is sort of dissolved into some sort of abyss. You gave it to your employees, and we're sort of exploring that. Why? How did that keep it alive?
Okay, one, to protect the values of the business that it was founded on, and I believe very strongly that the people most likely to do that are the people that are actually doing the work, who are close to the action. They're the people who feel, the passion, I suppose. And that has been proven out in the last 6 years. I feel absolutely confident that was the right decision. And one bit of it was, I felt I talked quite a lot about my beliefs, and well, I mean, one is that really I sat down and I thought, what do I want to do with my rest of my life? And I just couldn't see how £3 million wouldn't be enough, anyone who thinks that £30 million is going to make them any happier than £3 million is a complete idiot.
Why?
Just look at the evidence. Who's happy? You get that sort of money, all you're doing is excluding yourself from other people, really. You're isolating yourself with a bunch of, often quite unpleasant people. I'm sorry, I don't like rich people very much. The ones I meet, I feel very little sort of empathy with them. I don't want to spend my life with them. So that's how you end up locking yourself in a room with a bunch of twats.
Yeah.
And that's not how I want to live my life. I want to live,
so
I want to
away 22 million to the team. How did it work?
You might say I sold it for about 15 million less than it was valued at.
Right.
However, if the honest truth of that is that I hung on to 26%, and I always said I'm going to sell this 26% at market value. And when the time came after 5 years, I did sell it at market value, and it was an extraordinary amount of money.
Yeah.
and I have.
And you've kept that money.
I've kept that money, and I've given some away. I spend quite a lot of time working for a lot of charities. One in particular, and all the work that I do, speaking fees, publishing, and so on, all the money goes to them. But still, when you got that amount of money, it just keeps on growing. I mean, that's what sort of annoys people who say that these people are the wealth creators. I'm not a wealth creator. The people who are creating the wealth are the people who are doing the money.
It's all right, no worries.
Doing the money. The people who are creating the wealth, the people who are doing the work.
Yeah,
they're the wealth creators. I may be a risk taker. I've invested in a couple of businesses that I like and that I'd like to see to grow. I've given some away to community things, some to charity, and I plan to die, having given it all away.
But I like that.
I actually campaign for people like me to be taxed better through an organisation called Patriotic Millionaires. So, I mean, I do that. I do feel it very strongly, and the idea that I am irrational in doing this, and some people even believe slightly immoral because they have elevated neoliberalism and greed to the level of a religion. I really think it's got to be that extreme in the US and the UK, and they are offended by my actions. I just think, they're just so deluded. I'm not the idiot, they are. If they think that money is going to make them any happier, or it's going to make their children love them any more, or it's going to make their children's lives any better. Yeah, there's no doubt that a certain amount of money, and in the world we live in, having access to a secure place to live and not paying a bloody landlord half your income is a pretty important part, and I am helping my children to do that. But other than that, they're on their own. They've actually said they don't want to be separated from the people they grew up with by having large amounts of wealth. I mean, two of them have actually said that to me.
When you said there, it's neoliberalism and money and greed have become a religion, especially in the States. And I think at the beginning you said, people go to religion for a form of love and self-acceptance. And now I think the thing you said at the beginning, Guy, about, money's a form of love for some people. It gives you that self-validation. And I think it's interesting in terms of
how...
But
it doesn't really, does it?
It doesn't, no. It's faux. It's faux. I mean, it's fake.
It's very shallow.
It's like putting a plaster on cancer. It's not going to solve the problem. When you... I don't understand how the mechanics work. So the employees made a load of money, or like, are they incentives to stay on? Because in my head, I'm like, right, I've worked at Riverford. Guy's given me an X amount of cash. Like, what's the incentive? Because, again, another thing in nature, I've been reading a lot about Charlie Munger's book, is human nature is driven by incentives. So what are the incentives to keep people on and keep doing good? Do you know what I mean? If they made a load of cashish, like, trying to get it.
Well, I don't actually agree that, or it depends what you call incentives. If you draw that broadly enough, it might be. I
don't mean neoliberalism incentives. Yeah. It could be incentives in terms of like caring is an incentive.
If you include intrinsic motivations within that, then I would subscribe to that. Yeah. So the model that we followed, there are two models of employee. Well, to start with employee ownership, I would say the key part of it is that the co-owners have a meaningful say in the decisions and the direction that the business take, and that they have a share in the profits. That I would say were the main tenets of employee ownerships. And there are two forms of employee ownership. We're called direct share ownership, where the staff co-owners actually own the shares directly, individually, and when they leave, they can sell them. Or there's indirect co-ownership, and John Lewis would be the most famous example of that in the UK, where the shares are held in trust for the benefit of the current workers there. And that's the model that Riverford went down. The form of direct ownership probably gives you a slightly more entrepreneurial culture within the business. And we went around and visited a lot of co-owned businesses and talked to them. However, I suppose it fundamentally depends on what you believe in. I mean, I am attracted to an entrepreneurial, innovative culture. That's where I feel comfortable. However, I also believe that we're not motivated by greed and greed alone. So, and if you are, if you believe in a sort of collectivity, the indirect model where they're held in trust for the benefit of current employees, it did seem to be the model to go with. But I just couldn't make up my mind, and nor could the other directors. And actually, we left it to a group of a sort of council of workers at Riverford, and actually they came up, and it was one of the first steps in the employee ownership. I think I cried in the room. Actually, they were the highest paid and probably most eloquent people were the ones who would be able to own most shares and would benefit from a direct ownership model. However, these 30 people in a room, some of whom were, planting potatoes, operating a packing machine or whatever, you wouldn't think, and probably left school at 16. I mean, the sophistication and the generosity of their thought, it just blew me away, actually. And they collectively decided together that though it would not be in the interest of quite a lot of the people in the room, that they felt it was the best interest for Riverford and for the staff at Riverford to go for a trust model, so an employee benefit trust, which is what we went for. And I'm so glad that we did.
Sorry, employee benefit trust,
So the shares are owned by the benefit trust.
Yep.
And they have a board of trustees who keep an eye on the way that Riverford is run and make sure that it is actually run for the benefit of the co-owners. And they're also has to be for the benefit of the suppliers and nature and so on. There's quite a lot of other things written in there, but essentially it is run in that way. I know that's quite complicated for people to get their head around, but I think it works really, really well, and we have an elected co-owner council which has quite a lot of clout. I mean, it wasn't obvious how they were going to work, but they often raise issues for the board. I mean, beyond that, the management structure is fairly sort of conventional. But we use the council a lot to sound out ideas. I mean, they decide what everyone's paid, essentially. We have a remuneration committee, which 2 council members sit on and a couple of externals, and they decide what everyone was paid, from me, the CEO, right down through the business. And they are, their decision-making is incredibly sophisticated.
One thing I was going to ask is, what are some of the unforeseen or maybe opaque / hidden challenges in this in this collective kind of business model? Because I think every model has challenges.
Okay. Well, one thing that came up in our path to employee ownership was people kept on asking, isn't all this consultation going to slow down decision making and make us less responsive and flexible? Which I was amazed that people who, these aren't people who had been to business school. As I say, there are a lot of people who probably left school with no qualifications at all, and yet they were, had the really pretty sophisticated understanding of how the world worked around them. So I was amazed by that. And it hasn't proven to be the case. I don't think we've become any less.
Were they worried about decision by committee kind of thing?
Yeah. I think that sort of thing, which I think is
fair.
I think fair and what you would expect. So that would be one thing which hasn't so far proven.
And what have you put in place to do? Because I think this is a great lesson. Just doesn't matter what organisation is. Decision by committee, especially if you're building a small challenger brand, is putting brakes on or putting an anchor on the speedboat. Like, what are the things you put in place to avoid that?
Actually, I can only say that from my experience, that's not the case. I don't actually agree with that. Certainly, that's what I would have assumed and expected to happen. But I've seen no signs of decision making being slower. I think we don't consult on everything. We will consult on, I don't know, anything to do with benefits or pay or.
It's all good.
You will consult on anything to do with benefits or pay. But anyway, I can only say it hasn't slowed down decision making. It's certainly helped us to make better decisions and safer decisions. And I think it's been very good for the business.
So it's, when you said it's helped you make better decisions, how so? Like, what's the nuance in this way of working?
Well, I think by consulting more widely, you make sure that you are actually, a good decision. You should have thought through its impacts on everyone that it touches. I mean, it's quite difficult to do that, but as a manager, that absolutely should be. You should have a little checklist that you go through with your brain, and the more people that have that checklist, the less likely it is that you're going to neglect to consider a particular group. So you make better decisions. I wouldn't, I'm not speaking to someone who holds this as a philosophical belief. I'm speaking to someone who didn't think that would be the case and has through experience found.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think it's a fascinating place to play.
I'm saying it with a fair degree of confidence. Another problem with employee ownership is that, and this is something that our lawyers and advised us I was absolutely adamant that I was selling this business at a quarter of its worth, and it wasn't going to be demutualised.
Demutualised as in?
So, we had, you're probably too young to remember, if you had a mortgage, it would be with a building society, and those building societies were owned by their members, and that's what most people had. And they've all been, and many farmers were part of a cooperative that was owned collectively. And they've all been sold off into, typically they had quite a lot of assets which were attractive to the asset strip and, venture capitalists. So they'd come in and they'd buy it and typically strip it of all its assets and run it into the ground. That's normally what happened. And I was absolutely adamant that wasn't going to happen to Riverford. We had quite a lot of assets. It was potentially worth a lot of money, and people could come in and say, "I'll give each employee £50,000 and walk off with the business." So the kind of legal stuff around the business. Can't remember what the terms are now. Anyway, say that make it almost if it is sold, all the money goes to charity. No one can benefit to an extent, I think, more than twice their statutory redundancy. So there is no incentive for anyone to sell it. But that means that it is very difficult to raise capital. So were we to get into difficulties and wanted to raise money or, sell equity, it's virtually impossible. Were we to want to expand hugely, we saw some opportunity and we wanted to raise funds for that would be very difficult. But I sat down and I thought about that and I thought, you know what? If we get in that much trouble, it's probably all over anyway, so why not just let it go? And I don't want Riverford to go on some acquisition spree. I see this happen so much. It's normally driven by the ego of the board, typically the FD or CEO, want to grow. And that's where a lot of businesses get lumbered in debt. They bring in shareholders who have different aspirations. So But it is a risk, Well, actually, I don't think it is a risk. It was cited as a risk by our lawyers and financial advisors that we were putting the business in a vulnerable state by making it impossible to sell equity and raise funds in that way. We haven't had to yet. I mean, I've never borrowed substantially. The business has always grown on profits and very, very modest borrowings. And that continues to be the case, and long may it be so. I mean, when during COVID, like many home delivery food businesses, we made a pile of money.
Sure.
And but we knew that this wasn't going to last, and we put that pile of money in the bank. And it's still there, and we are slowly spending it on various projects, environmental investments and so on, electrifying our delivery fleet and putting solar panels on all the sheds and all that sort of thing. A lot of our competitors doing the similar thing, they made a load of money, and when COVID came to an end and their customer numbers started dwindling, they went on a marketing spree and just spent it all trying to maintain that growth. And then they couldn't maintain it, and they are in a far worse position than us, most of them now. So, just being, I don't know, I think having a sense, I think the internal approach to risk and capital that we have, I'm perfectly happy with it, but it was cited as a risk. That's probably way too long an answer, Dan. But,
no. Yeah. It's good. Well, it's great because it is super nuanced. And I think you've teased all those things out. It's not like it's not a binary decision. There's a lot of nuance to it. And I think, but what you were saying there, it's almost this, one of the themes today is this neoliberalism as religion. And I think people don't question why we grow. I interviewed, do you know David Hyatt, who does Hyatt Denim?
It's not Dave. It's David and Claire. Lectures.
I just watched.
I watched Charles just now.
What did I call him?
I think you called him Charles Hyatt. I know David.
David Hyatt. Sorry.
Yeah, I've got quite a lot of time for him. Can I tell you a little story about him?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I went to give a talk at his Do Lectures out in Pembrokeshire one year, and we got to know each other. And anyway, he came to visit me in Devon, and he's an absolute master at sort of, I don't know whether it's still called guerrilla marketing, but that sort of thing of, how challenger brands can behave differently. And he came down and he talked, we got gathered our marketing team together. And he said there in the meeting, if you want these guys to be creative, the last thing you want to do is give them any money. And they were a bit shocked because they was hoping this sort of guru of alternative marketing was going to come down and tell us how it's done, which must involve some big marketing spends. But it's never, the things he does are never big spends, are they? That's it's about being different and being different.
What did you implement off the back of his talk?
I can't remember actually, but it was, I think, a bit like when we spoke to Perry at Big Fish. A lot of it was about just being confident in who you are, and in being different, and in not trying to be like everyone, not trying to copy, other businesses, that spend a fortune on marketing, and normally through fairly conventional channels. And I think as a result, the way Riverford does, we spend very little on conventional marketing, almost nothing actually. But we will spend money on, now on sort of campaigns. So there are always things that we genuinely feel strongly about. So at the moment we have one running on farm washing, supermarkets pretending they're buying from small British family farms when actually in reality they're, undermining those farms and driving them out of business. So we have a campaign running on that at the moment. And, so we will often try and be initiating a sort of debate and a discussion, and that, we're able to pay for that by virtue that it does boost our own sort of awareness of Riverford, I suppose. But I would much rather spend the money doing something like that has, I believe is genuinely good for the world than in just spending a fortune bidding for words, with Google, or, putting a lot of leaflets through people's doors in the old days was, what happened, or, paying for posters in the tube or something. Yeah.
I watched your talk last night. Actually, I don't know why. It was about 12 years ago. It went on YouTube about 12 years ago at the Do Lectures.
At the Do Lectures.
And there was something you said which really struck a chord. And you were saying when you show different kids round, you were saying the kids from sort of lower income backgrounds and state schools are actually more interesting to show around the fields and farms because they ask better questions. I'd love to know why that is, and what, in your opinion, what sort of questions they were asking you, if you can remember, or not necessarily the questions, but the insights you were getting.
I do. I used to do all the school tours. I'm probably going back 20 years now or something, certainly 15 years. And I did used to really enjoy them. They were completely exhausting. I mean, it was a performance, but you're right. I did particularly enjoy, showing around the, let's say, the rougher kids that didn't have a cribbed sheet of questions that they had to answer at the end. These were kids who were on the farm because they were a nightmare to have in the classroom usually. And they were often a nightmare for the first half hour or so on. But, if you let them out in the fields and give them a chance to actually pull vegetables up and eat them or whatever, they normally got really pretty engaged. And it was I used to quite enjoy the challenge of, engaging the more rebellious, I suppose, and disengaged. And it did make, I don't know, I've always felt that there was a real opportunity to get people on farms. It could be an enriching experience, that farming could be about a lot more than just producing food, actually. I have to say that as the years have gone by and I got busy with other things, we've done less and less of that, which I do feel a bit regretful of. I think, I suppose it's the fact that I wanted to do that and I enjoyed doing it and found it rewarding, I think was to do with the fact that I do, on some level, seem to quite enjoy the sort of storytelling aspect of what we do. And of course, and I think that's what good marketing in our way anyway, it's about some sort of storytelling and using that storytelling to differentiate, what you do. And that can consume quite a lot of resources, but it's normally, well, my experience, it's been a cheaper way of getting your name out there than to just buy your reputation, I suppose, which is what most people do. They go to an agency and give them hundreds of thousands of pounds to go and have a campaign, and off they go. You
talked about having and working with Perry and stuff, and having confidence in your brand. This is what I was doing with Exploding Bakery yesterday with the session we were doing, the workshop I was doing with them. It's like they had this great brand, and then their sort of sales, they got these sales opportunities, and actually we were saying that the sales almost dictated the creative, whereby you ended up being kind of they're not a wishy-washy brand, but they've got like 4 or 5 different messages. They've got kind of a health message, a taste message, a fun and frivolous brand, a serious, and it's like, and I think at some point along your journey, look, they're 14 years in, I think, those guys, and they're amazing. I've got so much fun with them. The brand can become a little bit muddled, which is what's happened to them, or we're trying to strip it back.
Yeah.
But one of the issues they were saying is we don't, because we've been doing this so long, it's like having the confidence just to go like that. And you know what Perry was saying about live life on the veg or whatever. How did you lose the confidence as a brand? So I think that can actually happen, and it's something I haven't really talked about on this podcast. And then how did you find it again, just to kind of go, right, live life on the veg, this is what we're doing. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it's very easy to lose confidence when everyone around you is reading from a different script, which is, if you want to sell more of your product, get more customers, you go to an agency and spend a lot of money, and it's just about slapping people around the head with, your name and the hope that it will stick. And it does work, that's how most marketing works. And it does work. I mean, it's very expensive, but I just hate it. I deeply resent every penny spent on marketing. I just want to grow, really good vegetables and sell them to people as cheaply as possible, so they're accessible to people on all incomes. And and the more you spend on marketing, the less you're going to be able to do that. So I constantly bang on. I'm on my path to retirement now, but in board meetings about the basis of our marketing and sales has to be what's different about us. And there is so much that's different. We're following such a different path to the supermarket supply chain, which I think is just devastating British farming and devastating British food and devastating British rural society, actually. I mean, there's so much that do the different. Everything we do should be angled, should be shouting different. So and that's just not just the words that you use, because people forget words very quickly. It's the product that you sell, celebrating the weird and wonderful. It's being innovative in your packaging and being prepared to I don't know, use wooden boxes rather than plastic ones, and punnets and so on. And every opportunity that you have to actually demonstrate how different you are. So our packaging principle, I mean, most people, it's vital that the packaging, if you do use plastic, that is completely transparent so that you can see the product and even it shines at you. We don't need to do that. I mean, by the time the product's delivered to people's doorstep, they bought it anyway. So, we use compostable packaging, which is quite sort of opaque. And it doesn't need to be. It may not, on the surface of it, look attractive in the same way that things scream at you as you walk down a supermarket aisle, but we're in a different environment. We can use a different material. It is 100% home compostable, and we don't have to make it look like plastic. So, so actually making a point of it being different, it's just always... I mean, there's no point in it's just churlish being different just for the point of being different. I mean, it's a bit childish, I think. So we do, but we don't, we try and learn whatever we can from the industry around us, but we don't slavishly and unthinkingly follow it.
Coyoko is a Japanese noodle bar located in Hackney, London, offering a fast-paced dining experience inspired by Japan's train station eateries. It specialises in freshly made udon noodles and rich dashi broths. The menu is insane, a rich variety of hot and cold udon dishes, donburi rice bowls, and Japanese small plates like karaage chicken. I hope I've said that right. Also some banging seasonal vegetable tempura. Coyoko brings authentic Japanese comfort food right to the heart of East London. They've got 2 locations, one in Hackney, one in Soho in the city. And look, if you want to get your mitts on this absolutely insane grub, use this promo code on your Uber Eats app, Coyoko40. The details are as follows. You're going to get 40% off, up to 15 quid off, when you've got a minimum basket of £20. This offer, this wonderful offer, expires on the 28th of July. Get your mitts on Coyoko. Thank you so much. In half the time. Range reviews are happening right now, right this millisecond. Sainsbury's, Waitrose, Tesco, Ocado, Co-op, all looking for new banging challenger brands. Don't miss this range review and have to wait another 6 months. It's long. Don't lose precious shelf space to competitors. Don't let your buyer pick another brand just because you didn't have a Grand Slam deck. Northstar Category Management help you create banging supermarket pitch decks so good that buyers find it impossible to say no to. Challenger brands like Perfect Ted, Trip, Bulbing Co, Dash all love Northstar. Look, I am so confident in Northstar transforming your brand. We've got an exclusive Hungry offer. Your first month for free. Yes, free. Plus, we're going to give you a free 30-minute consultancy session to see how your brand is currently performing in category. Click the link in the show notes to book your consultancy session and thank me later. I think what you said there is the storytelling doesn't have to be words, which I really liked. I think Seth Godin, he was on the podcast the other week. Don't know if you know the marketeer. Seth Godin is a genius.
I've heard of him, yeah.
And he was saying storytelling doesn't have to be words. I'd love to understand. Henry Dimbleby's coming on the podcast in December. I've read his book Ravenous. It's great, and I'm really trying to understand how this food system's become so fucked. Basically, I'd love to go through sort of the history, and I'm not saying you're kind of a historian on this, but just to get some context of how the food system was. Then I think it's World War II was what happened when all this corn stuff started happening to keep us going in the war. And then what was the sort of the birth of the supermarket? I'd love to sort of go through that, and then we can understand how they've sort of ravaged you to smithereens, or tried to, I should say.
Well, Henry Dimbleby will be a much best person to talk to on this. I mean, he's he's done a lot of work in this area, but I mean, I don't know how far back you want to go to the pre-industrial revolution.
Go as far back as you can. Yeah, I'd actually quite like to go back as far as we can. Like, well, maybe we started
if you go back,
Henry VIII days or something like that.
You go back to a truly rural agrarian community where there were, very small.
What
towns.
year is that? Sort of like.
So you're going back to the 1600s, I would say.
Okay, right. Let's start there. Yeah.
And and most people, were living a rural existence. Most of their disposable income would go on food, and as we industrialized through the 1700s, I suppose, people started moving to cities. There was became more of a tradable market for food and farmers, and got a sort of heyday. I mean, in the UK, there was the heyday of British agriculture, which ran up to the mid 1800s, when there was the repeal of the Corn Laws, which effectively protected British farmers from food being imported, particularly from the USA, and that the prairies were being opened at that time. So I think the Corn Laws repealed in 1846, then they had the Civil War. So it took until about 1870 for it all to start flooding in, and indeed it did start flooding in. British agriculture went into a sort of terminal decline, which arguably it's never really recovered from. So, the beautiful stone buildings there, you can look, whenever you see a big barn like that, it was built before 1870.
Because
there was no money in farming to build buildings like that after that.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, you have big modern sheds, but nothing sort of built to last. So that, that was the heyday of British agriculture, and it went into a decline from then after, with the First and Second World War. Obviously, we were almost starved into submission by
So what
Germany.
happened in the first, and obviously, in the First and Second World War, what were the changes that happened?
Well, particularly the Second World War, we had become highly dependent on imports, and we couldn't import because Hitler kept sinking the boats with his U-boats, and we were almost starved into submission. So from after
and that's because they were bombing us,
sinking the ships coming over from the States.
As in, we couldn't grow our own stuff.
We were probably down to less than 50% self-sufficiency
because they were bombing us.
By the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, I'm guessing, but it was pretty low. We were importing a lot of stuff. We still had most of the empire, and a lot of food was coming in from there. You might say we were, raping the rest of the world to feed our industrialized society. And then, but that almost brought us to our knees, did bring us to our knees during the war. So after the war, during the war, there was the Dig for Victory thing, so massively elevated the status of farmers. And then farming was quite heavily subsidized and protected after the war to make sure that never happened again.
Yep.
So my parents started farming in 1951, which was still in food rationing, and they became farmers because...
Was your dad in the war?
Yeah. So when he was demobbed, he studied agriculture. He came from a family of decaying minor aristocrats, I suppose. But there was no empire for the useless children to go and exploit anymore. So he decided, he wanted to do something useful with his life. And for him, that meant being a farmer. And I have a huge amount of admiration, actually, and affection for their generation, that were... Britain was more indebted than it is now. I think I'm right in saying it was twice GDP, whereas it's about 1 times GDP. So we were absolutely fucked. Yet we still managed to, the aim was to create a country fit for heroes. We founded the welfare state, the NHS. We massively boosted food production, so we weren't in that state again. And indeed, it went right on until the birth of neoliberalism. So from, let's say, 1945, the end of the war, to 1980. By 1980, we were 80% self-sufficient in food in the UK.
What was that? The 60s and 70s was like the sort of the peace and the love and the hippies and the Beatles. Like was that almost like a kind of swinging it back post all the destruction in the war? Because I don't understand how we kind of got from that to this greed period. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of a weird...
Yeah.
What actually happened? Not necessarily...
I'm not a historian. I don't really understand. That was also, if you're in the States, that was the we've never had it so good era, wasn't it? I mean, we were, it was a time of extraordinary growth in wealth for most people, not for everyone. But I think there was also quite a lot of regulation in the economy, which ensured that the inequalities weren't too bad, that, everyone's wealth, and that became, where home ownership became the norm. And then but it came with lots of problems as well. Maybe we got fat, maybe the power of the unions was excessive. I don't know, depends on your political point of view. And we got to the 1980s and Margaret Thatcher being elected and the birth of neoliberalism. And it's all about, greed is good, and us all being individuals and making individual selfish decisions.
When was the genesis of the supermarket, and why was that?
Right. Well, I think you probably trace the history of Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer's, back to sort of the between wars years, I don't know, but I think their growth was probably when they really became the dominant retailing model was, I'm going to say between 1960 and 1980. That, prior to that, there would have been a lot of independence. Whereas now, if you look at groceries, I think the supermarkets, the big six, account for 90% plus of our groceries, and the independents are. Where are the independents? There's probably more food sold in garages now than there is in the high street through independents. We have farm shops. There are precious few independent food retailers. I think that loss of diversity, come back to the word we used earlier, is tragic, I think, in all sorts of ways. Because the retail market is concentrated in six businesses' hands, really, that they want to buy from big suppliers who can provide them with continuity and consistency. So that's driven a concentration and specialisation in farming. I would say since it's probably been going on for a long time, but I would say particularly since 1980. Whereas if you go back to pre-1980, the norm would have been a mixed farm, multi-enterprise. My father used to keep chickens, sheep, pigs. Cows were always the big thing. He grew barley and wheat and oats and turnips for the cows and kale and whatever. It was probably a mixed farm. Now, you look around here, either you're combinable crops or you're dairy, and if you're dairy, you're probably going to be a big dairy because all the small ones going out of business. Or the only ones, the small family farms are hanging on in sheep and beef. But I would say if you look at poultry, it's gone huge, highly specialised, controlled by a small number of companies. Pigs has gone the same way. My father used to keep 30 sows, then he got up to about 100, and then it just wasn't, now you'd have to have 1,000. And being part of some huge contract as well. Poultry's certainly gone the same way. Dairy is really, really quickly going from, small herds of, 100 cows out grazing to herds of 1,000 or more kept inside. 50% of milk sold to dairies, sold by supermarkets, is from cows that haven't been outside. They're just kept inside on concrete, throughout their 10-month lactation, and the food is brought to them and they're just milk machines. They die, live a miserable life and die at an early age. Probably, I think the average is 2-point-something lactations in the UK from an animal. So it's probably going to be about 4 when it dies from an animal that's natural life is probably 20 years. It is, they die of mastitis, lameness, or they become infertile in the shop, because their body cannot stand the metabolic demands being placed on it by, intensive dairy production. So I really lament the direction that dairying has gone. I lament the direction that pigs and chickens have gone. And this has been driven, I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened with supermarkets, but it's certainly happened a lot quicker and to a much greater extent because that's how supermarkets, they want to buy off larger producers. It reduces their transactional costs and enables them to drive down the costs of production. I think supermarkets have really driven the concentration, and the fact that they are so powerful in this country. I'm not saying it's happened across Europe, but it hasn't happened to the same extent it has here. And we have a particularly retailing model that really lacks diversity.
Yeah, what other countries have got a slightly different model in Europe, or maybe, I don't know, where else you've been?
Well, it's actually all of them. I do have a farm in France, and they have, a lot more diversity in their farming, a lot more smaller farms. They seem to be better at sort of cooperating together, and that, I think, has helped to sustain the smaller farmers and give them the benefits of scale that would normally only belong to much bigger companies. So, yeah, France definitely. Even the Netherlands, which has really led vegetable production, they are exceedingly good at what they do. But I would say the typical vegetable farm would be under 100 hectares, and they would probably be part of selling through a cooperative. Whereas now we have a situation in the UK where vegetable production is, there are 4 or 5 companies. There's one company that probably produces over 90% of the country's celery. and probably a lot of it's green salads as well. Well over 50% of the green salad just in one company, and they'll have farms in the UK, mostly in the east, quite a lot on the fens, in Poland, in Morocco, in Senegal, in Spain. That's the reality of how your food is produced, vegetables, but it's not coming from small family farms. And in those fields, there are vast harvesting rigs trundling across the fields, barely a word of English spoken. It used to be until Brexit, Russian. I mean, today, it could be Indonesian, but there are not very few UK nationals working in those fields because it's become a sort of underclass. I think it's morally and socially reprehensible that we are relying on an underclass to produce our food because we're not prepared to pay, what it would cost, to make it an attractive proposition for our own people. I mean, I don't know. It just seems all wrong to me.
What was the most heinous thing the supermarkets did to you when you were a farmer that made you forge this other path with Riverford?
Oh, I mean, their buying departments, and I really don't think this has changed very much. The standard of human behaviour from a supermarket buyer is just hideous. I mean, well, I'll tell you my story this is when I gave up supplying supermarkets, or just before it. I was getting ready. I'd put in my crop program. They'd agreed they were going to buy a certain amount. The buyer rang me up and said, "We'd like you to come and meet our technical guy next Thursday in London." And I thought, "Oh, that's great. There's no chance we could make it Friday, is it? Because I'm going to be in London for the weekend." And anyway, and the phone went dead on me. I rang him back, and I said, "I'm terribly sorry. I think we got cut off there." And he said, "No, Sonny, when we whistle, you jump. The only question is how high." And that was it. I told him to fuck off. I've never supplied a supermarket directly. And then no one should treat another human being like that. It's just appalling. And the interesting thing is that I actually met this bloke about 5 years later. He was working for another company, and he was a really nice bloke. I couldn't believe it. When I met him, he was this cuddly man sitting in a corner in a tweed suit, actually, and he was a teddy bear. But that's the way he behaved.
That's what we were saying earlier. Like, it's the macro religion of neoliberalism, but on the micro, people are actually just warm, cuddly human beings.
Yeah. So
it's the mixing of the two where it gets convoluted.
It's behaviour that becomes normalised. I mean, I firmly believe that most people are good and want to do good things most of the time, but we're strongly affected by the norms that we see around us. So if you are in a supermarket buyer's office, surrounded mostly in those days anyway by testosterone-fueled young men, and it's very, very aggressive environment, and you are moved around so that you never actually form a relationship with the people you're buying off, so you don't have those sort of responsibilities as a human being. That's where you're rewarded for how much margin per foot of shelf space you generate, whether you're selling knickers or digestive biscuits or Brussels sprouts, and you're moved around those departments so you never have a direct relationship with any of your suppliers, so you can be inhumane and never witness the consequences. That's how people behave. That's the normalised pattern of behaviour. And then what really upsets me is the mendacity of those supermarkets, who then will have a corporate, they'll have a load of stuff on corporate social responsible, or ESG as they call it now. They'll have an environmental policy. They'll have policies on everything. But if you actually speak to the buyer and said, "Oh, but your head of organic said this, this and this," they don't even know who he is. That there is no connection between their statements of morality and the actual people who are driving their behaviour, which is the buyers. They I don't know. I think they live in a different building. I mean, it's just rank hypocrisy. And
what are they doing to the farmers now? Because I've watched a few videos, and it's like they're it's almost they're forcing a race to the bottom. And then there's all this farm washing stuff, which is basically a quasi brand where they're saying that it is, so you can go and buy a packet of strawberries and it will have the British flag on it, but it could be from fucking anywhere.
To be fair, if it's got the British flag on it, I'm fairly confident saying it will have been produced in the UK. But you will walk.
What is farm washing then? So
you walk into I would say you walk into that supermarket aisle. Yeah, there are Union Jacks all around the place. There are lots of statements about supporting British farming. The tote bag that you walk away will have a British farmer on it. You know, you're sold that's the sort of backdrop, and then those strawberries. I'm not quite sure for strawberries, but I can't remember the name. But if you go to Tesco's and you buy a pepper, I think it's Rosedene Farm. They have the same for chicken, Willow Farm. So they're sold under these farm names. But actually the pepper, it might be produced in the UK in a limited season, but it could equally well be produced in Morocco, Senegal, the Netherlands.
And it's all under the brand of
Willow Farm. There will be a thing on the packet saying that it's produced in that country. It'll be quite small. It'll be much smaller than the one saying Rosedene Farm, which clearly implies it's produced in Britain. But legally, they have fulfilled their obligations, and they're Union Jacks everywhere, despite the fact, many times a year there's more Spanish stuff there than British. So it's a sort of deceit, and based on the fact that we're all busy, aren't we? We don't, when you go to a supermarket, do you read every label really? I mean, we just don't have the time. So we're forming these, we're cognitive misers. We don't have the time to gather all that information and process it. We are emotional decision makers on the whole. 90% of our behaviour is driven by our emotions, and supermarkets and their marketing advisors know that only too well, and they play off it. So they give us the emotional feel that we're supporting a British farmer, when in reality, their trading practices are undermining British farming, and destroying the family farms that I think most people would like to support. So, and at a really alarming pace. This is not something that's happening gradually. I mean, the movement of dairy cows from small family farms to large dairies where they never go outside is happening really quickly. I mean, it's happened over the last 10 years, so that now, 10 years ago, 90% of them would have been relatively small farms out grazing the pastures. Today, over 50% of the milk you buy in the supermarket will come from a cow that has not been outside during its lactation. And, the food is brought to it, and it's just a, milk-producing machine living a miserable, stressed life. So that farm washing is the dishonesty by which
it's almost a sort of odious growth or boil out of the sort of neoliberalism that we were talking about at the beginning, and it's greed going further.
And it's really hard to argue with it. I mean, a supermarket will put forward a spokesperson who will say that they're keeping food, affordable to all, and that if we listen to this weird bloke guy Singh-Watson and did his thing, everything would be more expensive and it would be exclusive. In fact, it's an affront because he wants food to be more expensive. Actually, I do want food to be more expensive. I want farmers to be paid more for it. I don't think that necessarily means it's more expensive, because farmers, we get about 25 pence in the pound for fruit and vegetables sold. The supermarkets and the middlemen take the rest. So actually, doesn't necessarily. Maybe they could cut their margins a bit, and we could be paid what it genuinely costs to produce a strawberry and have, a UK national picket under reasonable working conditions. And it's anyway. Yeah.
What's the feeling amongst farmers now? Because I think it is, when as you say, you're in London, you're going into a Tesco Extra or a Sainsbury's local, had a stressful day at work, you're just thinking, fuck it, I'll pick that up, eat it. And I think you just do. Again, through these norms, you just kind of eat food without necessarily, and I do this the whole time, without necessarily understanding where it's come from. What's the feeling amongst farmers, like in the zeitgeist now, about how it's all going to play out?
The mood in the industry is pretty bleak, actually, and has probably been getting worse for a few years now. I mean, that is the result of, I would say, the supermarket buying practice is the biggest factor, but, climate change has thrown some real challenges at British farming. Not this spring, 23 spring. Well, actually, this spring was pretty bad. So we've had 2 very wet springs, and the previous winter, a lot of farmers were unable to sow their crops because it was just too wet. I mean, weather patterns are changing. They're becoming less predictable. that is making life, really hard for British farmers. I'd say particularly arable farmers, but even livestock farmers have had their challenges. So climate change is an issue. Brexit and the associated changes in farming policy have introduced a level of uncertainty, which British farming could really have done without. I mean, it may be that the ELMS, environmental land management schemes, and the greater emphasis on delivering environmental and social goods, I think it could be a good thing in the long run, but we are going to have a period of disruption and uncertainty, which, any industry, we just want a stable environment to operate in and run our businesses so that, it's been massively disruptive. You think that 50% of farm incomes comes from, various government payers, essentially from the payments, essentially from the taxpayer. And those are really not only are they being threatened and reduced, but how they will be paid is being massively changed. And the administrative, bureaucratical cost of accessing those funds is becoming really very substantial, to the extent that I do actually worry that, we're a small 150-acre farm, and we've done very well out of it, but only by virtue of Riverford paying for someone to fill in all the forms. I couldn't have done it for our mid-tier stewardship form, and they've done a very good job, and we've done well. So it is a good thing, but I do worry that smaller farmers won't be able to afford to access it. So it could, in worst case scenario, become yet another pressure towards scale, because it will be the large landowners who can afford to employ the consultants to fill in the forms. I'm sorry, that's the way it's turned out. So uncertainty around Brexit, and another big factor in that is the availability of labour. We have an industry that used to be very dependent on Eastern European labour. It's no longer available. So we're, sending planes around the world to try and bring in people from, who knows where. And often people who have been really badly exploited in that process. It's pretty shameful, some of the stuff you read about. It's not necessarily what's happening actually on the farms. It's often the people they've had to pay to get to the farm in the first place, though. So there are a lot of climate change, Brexit, supermarket pressure are all, putting a lot of pressure on British farming. And to the extent that, according to our research, I think it was 61% of farmers fear that they're going to be out of business in 18 months. And those will be mostly the smaller family farms.
What's the sort of utopia or the desired outcome, which isn't going to change the infrastructure? Again, this was a Seth Godin podcast I did. It's like, and he talks about the flow of, he uses nature as the analogy, and it's about going with the flow of the current, or you can push against it. And it's like, a utopia may be, let's get rid of supermarkets, but let's be pragmatic here. Like the rivers, they're already entrenched in the system, and there's only so much you can do to change the system on a massive level. But what would you say are what's the utopia in your head? But then what is probably the pragmatic place that we actually could get to with some of the changes that you want to put in place, as you kind of take a step back from Riverford?
Well, my utopia, and I find it very difficult to see a route to this utopia, but my utopia would be a food and farming system in the UK. So when I say system, I mean the farmers, the retailers and the food service people and the people in between. So where there was a lot more diversity, so we wouldn't be so dominated by 6 major supermarkets, or at least if they were those 6 major supermarkets, they would genuinely be connecting with their farmers at a local level and buying some of that stuff locally, which is what most people want. It's what most customers want. And if we had honesty, I think market forces, even neoliberalism, would drive them towards that. But because we have such mendacity in their sort of marketing, that we have a sort of situation which is, really market failure. But we desperately need more diversity, and I suppose the model for that I would take, if you go to true utopia, would be my wife's pub in Totnes, 6 miles away from us here.
Ate last night. Well, last two nights. Food's delicious, yeah.
Well, she has a team in the kitchen headed up by Johnny, who grew up with my sons and, grew up in the village, and I was friendly with his father and so on. So it's all very local. And he really does cook from what is available locally, mostly from our own farm. So we have Aidan, who grows Aidan, who grows vegetables just outside here, and most of his income's from selling to the pub. And the reason that works is because he had a good relationship, Aidan and Johnny, and that Johnny has the skills, and my wife Geeti and her team give him the agency to be able to make his own menu and use and change it frequently, and I think it's so enriching to both the grower and the supplier, and the people who eat there have this wonderful food. Sometimes there's no fish on the menu because the fishers haven't been able to go out. Sometimes there'll be no beef on the menu for weeks because, a bullock hasn't been killed. Sometimes it's just lamb because we have lambs here through the week, and I tell you what, as a customer, I don't think they notice that. So this sort of, the customer has to have whatever they want, whenever they want it. I just think it's tosh.
But I also think there's a massive movement now to this kind of in British food, into these places where it is sort of farm to table, field to fork. I went down.
I'm sorry, Dan. I'm going to stop you there. There isn't.
Yeah. Do you not think so?
No, I really don't. I mean, her team are going to try and train some chefs, and they're being flown to Copenhagen. I'm slightly embarrassed next week.
Where's that? To Noma or somewhere like that?
Actually, it is to do with the guys from Noma. But
Interesting. Yeah.
But it's an offshoot of Noma, and they're trying to improve sustainability. But I just cite this as an example that they have to bring Geeti's team, because they are one of the very few people who are actually doing it. People have become very eloquent in using the language, but I mean, there is so much bullshit on restaurant menus, and so many people claiming to be using locally sourced and this, that, and the other, when actually it's just coming from the normal supply chain. So I think it's a lot of bullshit.
Interesting. Yeah. So what I was where I was going with that, and again, maybe there is just a blinded by the bullshit, maybe, and I'll hold my hands up if that's the case. But I was thinking that there's this movement, albeit fucking tiny compared to the mass. It's almost like, okay, for another example, like social media got huge, and everyone sort of became addicted to it, and it's like this massive thing that's taken over TikTok. There is a small pocket now of more people getting into meditation, but to kind of balance it out. I think everything in the world does balance out ever so slightly, right? Food is gone fucked with all this neoliberalism. You've got chains, McDonald's. I believe there's a small pocket, albeit tiny, of places like Geeti's place. There's a place in Cornwall called Four Boys, Crocodile Farm in Cornwall, which is another great restaurant.
Yeah, no, Crocodile Farm.
Yeah,
I'd say they are doing the real thing then.
I went there the other week, actually, really good. Yeah. But these small places, and again, it's like we're talking...
Coombe Farm as well.
Yeah, Coombe Farm, that's what... The Exploding Bakeries was saying. Yeah. But I think there's a small little niche of people, and then you're going to get these, a bit like what Bold Bean's doing with his scratch cooking, like actual ingredients. But then at the same time, it's slowly, I think people are getting sick of this sort of mass market. But again, as you say, it's so small in the grand scheme of things.
Well, that's what we do. We need to have this sort of diversity. But, I mean, what happens normally is it just gets subverted by, capitalism. I mean, they are incredibly good at stealing our clothes. And telling the story, presenting, the sort of light version, which fits into their business model. So, I mean, you were just talking about the Exploding Bakery. I mean, it is interesting. I don't really know anyone who's, an authentic baker who's scaled it up and sells, a good sourdough loaf or I mean, I actually know the guy who runs Gale's Bakery a little bit, and I think they do it better.
Is that Tom?
Yeah.
I
think they do it better than most, but I would actively avoid it myself. I mean, they're just sort of a proper, but they're the light version, aren't they? They're made, in a factory, banging out tens of thousands of those loaves. They run a very good shop. Some of their things is, I don't know, I don't want to knock it too, because they're probably a better example of someone.
Yeah, I love Gates.
Yeah, they've done a better example of commercializing. But I mean, I don't know, if you go to a supermarket thing and you walk down the vegetable aisles and you would, unless you had a really questioning mind, unless you were really alert to the dangers of being bullshitted, you would walk down the end of the aisle and you think, oh, this is all British stuff. It all comes from family farms. It's all lovely. They've sort of subsumed themselves. And it's so good at doing that. We have our most creative minds going into brand management and marketing that will, it's always so much cheaper to tell the story than it is to actually do the deed. Because operating the way that most people want their food to be produced is it's going to be more expensive and I get a bit. I mean, I don't know how many versions I've seen, of Tesco's. I go back to when I was supplying supermarkets and I was invited to go when everything was going to be carbon labelled. That's right. Everything was going to be, that was the thing. Then we'll adopt that. And then they just drop it 6 months later. Then the next one, everything was going to be local and we were all invited into, and they were going to source locally. That became out of fashion and we'll drop that. Next thing, everything was going to be wonky veg and it was all about reducing waste. And as soon as your attention is drawn by something else, they will drop it and it just goes back. So they're so good at just, taking the lightest version of whatever the current trend is, but basically continuing and projecting that as what they're doing, but basically continuing as business as normal. To actually challenge mainstream capitalism, my God, it is so difficult that it's despite the fact that, I think so many people want something else. I mean, I've built a business over 40 years, based on the fact that people are pissed off with how their food is produced and finds its way to their door. But they even started doing, all supermarkets even started doing veg boxes for a while, because they had to have a bit of that action. I don't know. I'm being a bit depressing, Dan. You better.
No. It's understanding the system. I think is very important, and that was something Seth Godin was telling me about. You got to understand the system to push against the system. The example he used was, and look, this is maybe not the best example, but he was saying, Cadbury's chocolate is the system and Tony's Chocolonely, and I know there's that's to be debated with how ethical that actually is, but that's still, they're still trying to do something to push against the system. I suppose understanding your system and then understanding how to push against that. Yeah, so I think it's good to understand the system and understanding what you're pushing against is kind of the first point. I'd love to know, with that utopia you're going to get to or try to get to, how do you actually do that? What are the three things that you can actually do? Do you know what I mean?
I have become a bit dispirited in systems change. I just after 40 years, I feel a bit worn out by it. So my approach to, I'm afraid I believe that we probably are fucked. I have very little faith in capitalism being able to solve the social and environmental problems that we face. However, I would rather go down fighting. So, I just want to live a good life and try and affect the things around me, immediately around me, that I can touch and improve those. And I'm almost trying to avoid getting involved in the wider debate. So trying to run our farm well and bring back biodiversity to the farm and make sure that the people who work here are well treated and making Riverford employee owned and so on. Those are the sort of things that I am now focusing on, because I suppose maybe it's a sort of selfishness. Maybe I'm looking after my own mental health, but when I go out into the world, and I do go and give quite a lot of talks on values-driven, purpose-led businesses and so on. And I go up to London and talk to all those bright young things, and they start talking to me about their exit plan or whatever before they've even done anything. And I just realise that I'm living in a world that I find it very hard to relate to. Certainly, I do meet lots of people who are genuinely driven by wanting to do something well. In fact, I was asked more or less, what is a purpose brand to you? Well, I just think, I said, look, it's just showing up every day and trying to do something really well.
Yeah.
But that's what it is to me.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start talking about, I don't know, your exit, or probably, I suppose you have to think about your brand. Realistically, this is the world we live in. You have to be conscious of how you're projecting yourself. But I think, actually being driven by the desire to just do something really well, with a genuine passion is what's going to make you purpose-led.
I want to talk about Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, and being in nature. I thought that was a really interesting place we were playing in. How does that link to the sort of the survival of the fittest and neoliberalism and getting better? And how do you think brands can exist in that place?
Well, I do think the theory of sort of competition driving natural selection and so on, and the basis of evolution according to Darwinism has fallen very neatly into the neoliberal sort of agenda that progress comes from competition.
But you see that out in nature as well. You see those
to some extent, but not entirely. No, I don't think. I notice that the trees, I've just planted 3,000 hazels, which I'm hoping to, and I noticed the ones that are close together are doing much better than the ones that are spread far apart. There are many examples in nature of cooperation and things working together, and I think a greater understanding of soil health and mycorrhiza, and particularly how perennials, trees largely, communicate together and even help each other, is actually changing that narrative a bit. So I think it's a false narrative to sort of pretend that neoliberalism and the power of the individual and market forces are somehow some sort of Newtonian law. Well, like gravity, what goes up must come down. It's just bullshit. And I don't believe it. I don't subscribe to it. I think there are lots of examples. I mean, obviously, look at bees, and you'd say that they all share the same genes, so maybe that does conform to the. It's the extreme. It wasn't so much Charles Darwin's natural origin of species. I think it was Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which are probably neoliberalists would subscribe to most as the law of nature that we all should subscribe to. Yeah, it's a false narrative. I mean, even some of the theories about genetics and and are being challenged now. I was taught when I was at school that our genetic material was completely immutable, unaffected by the environment. It turns out that that's not true.
Yeah. I was going to say other things, and what are other things you spot in nature?
That is not to deny that we are selfish sometimes. I mean, that's not to deny.
You were talking at the beginning. You push through people. There's the selfish gene in that. And you needed to do that.
And we do look after those closer to us. Arguably, if you're a Darwinist, those that have the same genes as us, our families. I'm not denying all that. I'm just saying that it doesn't explain everything. It's not the only motivating force, behind our behaviour.
Mm. Yeah. I know you like picking artichokes. What does that teach you about life?
I love picking artichokes.
Why artichokes?
Why artichokes? They are. I just think they're a really beautiful plant. They are. They look like a weird fucking. I love eating them.
Dragon's egg or something.
I love eating them. You see, there's a whole load of them in the bowl there. There's another crate of them as you walked in. Yeah. So I love eating them, and someone once told me that they cleanse your liver like most bitter flavored vegetables. And that I needed to cleanse my liver because I was an angry person. I don't think I am as angry as I used to be. I love picking them. They look beautiful in the field. They're one of the few vegetables you don't have to bend down to pick. But the thing that has really driven me in recent years, and why we grow a ridiculous amount of them now on the farm, is that they're perennials. You don't have to cultivate the soil every year. We just cultivate very shallowly between the rows once or twice a year. And they just keep coming back. So they harbour the soil structure underneath them is just beautiful after 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's better than you'd find under, permanent pasture, which is generally what farmers might grow to recover their soil. So they're very good for the soil. They're a whole ecosystem in themselves. I love that as the aphids arrive in the spring and then the ladybirds are after them, and they have a sort of balance within the fields. There are always lots of wildlife in the hares.
When you say they're an ecosystem in of themselves,
okay.
So say is a carrot? Carrot. I'm asking some dumb questions here.
No, well, okay, because they're there for many years. The insects and weeds and birds and even the hares that like being in that, they thrive and they build up and you get a sort of stability. Whereas if you're growing an annual crop where you plough it every year or spray it off with glyphosate, as many farmers do, and sow your crop, you're disrupting it every year. You're never getting a chance for the organisms to evolve into what, ultimately into what is known as a climax community, which would, in this part of, would be largely an oak forest. Obviously we're not going, but we're with the artichokes that are there for 8 years, maybe we're a step on the way towards that. And it's, environmentally, it's much richer. And I do feel with climate change, the threat to our soils from leaving them exposed, ploughing them every year is, I'm not sure, anyway, that our agriculture should be so dependent on growing annual crops, which in nature would probably represent a fraction of 1% of the surface area, is something that we need to consider. So, I think much more perennial crops, food coming from perennial crops would be a very good thing.
What other lessons do you take from nature that you can apply to sort of business or brand building?
We kind of done that. Do you want me to go over it again, or do you feel you...
Well, I was just wondering if there's... Well, what you said about you said, I think the first two things were the diversity and the strength of diversity, the humility, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
But what you said there earlier about the two... almost like the selfish gene versus the trees that are closer together, growing together. Maybe not what business has taught you about, nature's taught you about business, but almost like the truths it debunks, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think being embedded in nature, it has taught me, I've already mentioned, humility, the value of diversity, but I think also just the sort of feeling that we're not always competing all the time. I mean, certainly when I grow vegetables and they're close together, then they are competing with the weeds. But if I walk out into the woods and across the pastures, I see species that are, interacting and complementing each other in a stable, self-sustaining ecosystem, and actually the sort of competition that we so often talk about, it's kind of not. I mean, a lot of plants are really happy living in the shade of another plant. A lot of the hazels that I planted really like being close together, even slightly shadowed by, in the wood, you see that they were traditionally grown as an understory, and they grew up straight as a result, and they made hurdles out of them, for instance. So that there are, and I have tried planting hazels on their own in the field, and they really don't like being on their own. And the same, so my brother sows oats and triticale as a main crop, and he undersows it with clover, red and white clover, vetches, peas, deep rooting things like chicory and so on. And actually the barley and oats, that top story, serves as a nurse crop to actually, and helps those smaller seeded, less vigorous plants establish underneath. And then when you cut the barley, which is an annual, it leaves those other plants, which is a perennials, to stay, and they'll be there for 5 years as a mixed pasture. So again, that they're actually complementing each other, and I think trying to understand nature and working out how it can work together, how we can bring species, together in a way which is complementary rather than always thinking about competition. Maybe that is a lesson that can be applied to life.
It's holding up two opposing things. Like on the one side is this competition, survival of the fittest, but on the other side there's this kind of kindness. And I suppose with the Riverford journey, you had that at the beginning, those demons, you said, that drive to get from A to you're almost that just tunnel vision, and then as you move it here, it's like this sort of kindness and collectivist, which has sort of kind of tempered those demons. Talk to me about surfing. Like, what does that? Why is that useful for you?
How
often do you surf?
Yeah, well, I would surf every other day if I had the chance. I surfed on Monday, I think, got in, and it was just beautiful. And I just felt, there was no one else in the water. So I walked down to the cove, paddled out, got a few waves. Sun came out, and I don't know, it just sorts my head out, really. I'm a bit of a loner. I like to go, I don't care how far I have to walk. I like to be on my own or with my sons. I never go to the crowded spots. I'm 64 now, so I'm obviously not as fit as I used to be, and I'm getting a bit slow to my feet. I'm not much good on the big days anymore, but I love it. Yeah, it's just, and I do love finding myself comfortable. It's quite an alien environment. Obviously, the sea, we didn't evolve to be out there, and to be out there on your own, and to find, obviously you're incredibly vulnerable and you're getting buffeted around on one place, but for that to be okay, and to get confidence in it, and I don't know, I do find it just always, almost invariably, makes me feel better when I get out. Yeah.
Weren't you with Perry? Perry told me a story about you sitting with him on the rocks or something.
I do actually really remember that day.
What was that about? Because that was, I think he actually told it on a podcast before about when he was coming up with, maybe not like the live life on the veg.
Yeah.
He was basically saying to me, you had to get out of, if you want creativity. And I think nature is a source of sort of kindness and creativity. I think Darwin had a walk he would do every single day before he would go and write, was a specific walk through nature every single day to kind of program his brain to get into the thinking mode. And Perry was kind of lynching onto that, was saying, you have to get out of the boardroom to get these ideas coming. But he talked about a day with you guys surfing. Talk to me about that.
I remember we met up and we drove up to the north coast, up to Croyd, and I think the surf was a bit crap, but I think we had quite good fun anyway. And I remember we got out and we had, I remember sitting on the rocks. I can remember eating sandwiches. The bit that I remember is him telling me, I bet lots of people like you, Guy, lots of entrepreneurs who are, thinking about, I think we were talking about employee ownership and who had sold their businesses anyway. And he said they all end up divorced, dyslexic and depressed.
Right.
He says, I call you the 3 Ds. And, a huge number of entrepreneurs are dyslexic. It's a weird correlation, but I mean, we could talk about that if you want. I don't know, they probably put too much into their businesses and not enough into their families, and that probably leads to divorce, I think. Anyway, and I was, sure enough, divorced shortly after that. I think the depression he was talking about was the ones that because he's worked with a lot of founder-led businesses that have been sold, and they always end up on PROZAC. And he did cite a couple of examples, which I won't repeat. But
do you think it's
because you built this thing you built this thing which is so personal to you, and personal and purposeful. It is your purpose in life. I mean, it is. I always used to say it was my fifth child business, and I wasn't going to sell that to someone else because it would be like selling that child into prostitution. But most people do sell it, and they lose their purpose. Someone comes in, they do something completely different. They always say, "Oh, it'll carry on just the same." You'll just have lots more money to be able to bring your ideas into fruition. It never works out like that. Soon as sign of trouble is, they want to make sure that the margins are generated, and so on. The business changes, the values are undereroded, and the founder exits and normally becomes depressed.
That putting that purpose, pull out purpose, and you'll supplant it with PROZAC is an interesting thing. Do you know what I mean? But it's true. The couple things, then we'll wrap this up. But I've loved this, mate. It's just my mind's kind of bubbling with just new wisdom. But I think it's really important to talk about kind of failures, and I'd love to know what some of your favourite failures that have retrospectively set you up for success. But I think you have to make those, it's almost that adaptive thing, and pulling this into the lens of nature. You need to expose yourself to get stronger. The gene gets stronger by exposing itself to sort of negative or potentially harmful things, but it makes it stronger.
Yeah. Well, if I go right back to the very early days, I remember my first year I planted a lot of leeks, and a disease called rust, puccinia, something or other. It's a fungal disease. Anyway, came in September. It spreads in warm, wet weather, of which we have plenty in Devon in the winter, and it just ripped through this field, and it looked like they were all going to die. And this was my first year. I wasn't yet organically certified, and I had various people come out and look at them and said, yeah, well, you need to spray it with this, that, a fungicide, and that'll clear it up, boy.
Really? Yeah.
I don't know why, but I didn't, and they recovered, and the temperatures dropped and the leeks grew away from it, and I actually had a fantastic crop in the end. So I suppose that thing of just having a bit of sort of faith in nature and not looking for... I'm far from convinced that if I'd sprayed them, it would have cleared it up anyway. But the idea that you have to do something... I mean, sometimes it's best to just wait and see. You don't always have to have a solution. And you know, as I said earlier, sometimes you're just, you know, being buffeted along and you just have to go with the flow, and sometimes it'll be all right and sometimes it won't, but reaching for a chemical container is not always the answer. And then I remember similar thing a couple of years later in a field of potatoes where blight, Phytophthora infestans, was ripping through them and they were dying. And at that stage, we used to spray them with copper sulfate, which was allowed under organic standards. It's been used for hundreds of years, 0 mammalian toxicity. However, it is not good for the soil. But anyway, I'd mixed up a tank full of copper sulfate and I was out in the field spraying, and the tracked out a flat tyre, so I had a full tank, leaking old sprayer, dripping this bloody stuff. It was the end of the day. I'd probably done a 16-hour day. I was completely exhausted, and the tyre went bang on the tractor, and I got off, and I just fell to my knees and wept. I was just exhausted, and I just felt that everything was against me, including nature. And I remember looking up to the big man and thinking, you know, what the hell, why are you doing this to me? It all just felt so sort of personal. And I think but then I think it emerged to me that it wasn't personal and, you know, no one was going to die. This was just...
Was it gave that you sort of that humility again?
Yeah, I think so. And then I suppose later in my career, I did...
What about in those, you know, those that early period where you said you had that sort of, you were trying to get your father's approval and you had that demonic drive, and you said you like brush people, you did some things you regretted. Like, what were some of those things that you'd kind of...
Well, there were a lot of small sort of detailed things. I mean, there was a company in Wales called Organic Farm Foods that we used to sell our vegetables through, who I had some respect for. They were by no means a perfect company. Anyway, it became apparent to me that I had no future. We were selling to Waitrose and Sainsbury's through this company, and I decided that the only way, and I'd founded a co-op by then, so I was representing 10 other farmers, and I did reach the conclusion that there was no way that we could carry on trucking our vegetables to West Wales, that we needed to supply them direct, you know, that we were just going to be driven out of business because we had these additional costs of getting the stuff there and then paying their margin. So I went behind their back to actually speak directly to the customer, which was a morally dubious thing to do. I feel it was justifiable to this day because, and indeed they did go out.
That's a disease of the, as we were saying, this. Well, it's not a disease; it's a byproduct of the neoliberalism and the survival of the fittest mentality, which that early, as we were linking this to nature.
Well, I suppose so. Yeah, if I was going to be in that business, I really think I thought I had no choice, so maybe I shouldn't have been in that business. But I mean, then a lot of things, I don't think I looked after my staff very well, actually. I kind of expected everyone to be like me and to work ridiculous hours and at a ridiculous pace, and in a way that I think was just unrealistic and unfair. And I think staff at Riverford, co-owners now, are much better looked after. I mean, as a result, we are more expensive,
I interviewed the founder of Brewdog, James Watt, and he said that, and he was saying that his biggest learning was, or the hardest thing to accept, is that the team are never going to be on your wavelength, because they're not, even if they've got shares in the business, even if they're like an MD. How did you navigate what were the mistakes you made in that sort of period?
Well, they're never going to be on your wavelength. They're never going to be like you. And thank God, I would say. I mean, we really don't need very many entrepreneurs like, I don't know, the bloke from Brewdog. He's got a checkered reputation, hasn't he? But we don't need, many, overt extreme entrepreneurs. I don't think. I mean, I think they leave a havoc, wake of destruction behind them quite often. But
don't they create loads of jobs and like new things? Because again, that's
things. There's no
an interesting
getting
thing,
it off the ground.
Yeah.
Starting. Most businesses, you kind of have to cut some corners to get going, and that that may be, not observing health and safety regulation or GDPR stuff in the way that you did when you as you get larger. But there comes a time where you've got to grow up. and I think it's really important that those founders who have a different operating, manual, that they realise it's time to grow, and either they do grow up or they step aside, which is I can't be done with all the systems that take to run a business well and look after people and make sure they're safe at work and make sure their health and their mental health is looked after. I'm not that person, but I do respect the need for that. So it's time to hand it over to the people who can do those things, which is what I've done. And people are really well looked after at Riverford now. But they wouldn't have been if I was still there. I think I would have struggled anyway. What
were you struggling with it? Because I've got a small team now running this podcast, and I find that one thing I do is I'd say because I'm just constantly thinking of shit. Is I'll say one thing, and then 2 minutes later, like I'll send a Slack saying, "Can we do this? We're going this way now."
Okay.
And it's like they've even said to me you need to chill out and just survive. But I don't know how to do it.
Well, my managing director, CEO, has told me not to send out, that I shouldn't be sending emails to, at least they should be directors or heads of departments. I would have sent a direct mail to someone who I knew was doing it and say, how about if we do it this way? And that's immensely disruptive. I mean, because most people, unlike you, I suspect, and certainly unlike me, they work best with structure around them. I mean, most people do. I would say 90% of people, the people who are comfortable with a constantly moving, unstructured, almost anarchic environment, are typically the founders, entrepreneurs, and I think you just need to respect that other people don't operate like that. They need to know where they fit, what their role is in a much more defined way, and they're probably not as creative, but they bring their own sort of talents. They bring iterative improvement. They bring a structured approach. They bring consistency. Which are all things that you need as a business grows and matures. So.
So there's a great kind of final thing, great essayist called Paul Graham who set up the Y Combinator. And Y Combinator, or YC Combinator, they're almost like, they call themselves a factory of startups. They created Dropbox, Airbnb, Twitch, Reddit, like a whole more Silicon Valley tech firms. Yeah. And there's an article, and he talks about how there's a lot of discourse and about the managerial stuff, about like how to be a good manager. These are the systems we need in place. And he says this is great, and it's all about this essay. It comes from a talk by the guy who set up Airbnb, and you've got all the best founders in the room. And he said that's great, but we haven't done any discourse on what he calls founder mode. And founder mode is what we need to inject back into the businesses so they don't become too stale. So it's like, it's almost the other side of that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think that's a fascinating subject. And my one concern about Riverford, in general, I'm really, really happy with the way it's going. But, they are great at iterative improvement. They're great at doing what we've done for some time better than I could ever have done it. And looking at, they are excellent at that. But we live in a rapidly changing world, and there'll come a time where, you do need, probably, we're going to need to make a bigger change. And I do slightly worry about, we've started using the term of who's the change maker in the room. And don't think I'm seeing them. And I think we need to, while we got money in the bank and a loyal customer base, we need to be looking for that change maker and preparing for, what's likely to come next. The biggest innovation for Riverford was turning our back on supermarkets and adopting a direct-to-consumer, i.e. the veg box model. But that was 32 years ago now. That's quite a long time. And since then, it's been iterative improvement and small changes. So, I think we probably should. Well, we did. With recipe boxes, we thought might be that thing. So we started, and we've done that very well. But it's proven to be a difficult market because we're surrounded by much bigger players who are all, incredibly well funded by venture capitalists and don't seem to care about.
The Gustos and the River, not the Riverfords.
Mindful Chef and Gusto and HelloFresh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any of those businesses ever made a penny profit. They won't have returned anything to their shareholders.
What's wrong? Yeah, what's wrong with those business models? Because I don't know who was telling me about that, but apparently they don't actually make money.
They're probably spending £100 to acquire a customer, many of whom they will come in on a discount, and they'll probably leave when the discount runs out. So they have this tremendous customer churn, and they're just not making the margins to pay for it.
So is it
spending they were spending like typically 30% of revenue on sales. Now I'm sure that will have gone down, but I doubt that. I don't think from the information I've had, possible exception of Mindful Chef, I don't think any of them have generated a profit yet. But the business model is that the investor. The business model is that the venture capitalist, typical, has a 3 to 5 year window. 5 year would be quite generous. And they are hoping to grow sales 10 times, and sell it on. And they normally try and sell it on before people start asking the questions about margin, and then that becomes someone else's problem.
Oh, really?
So and that's typically, that's what happened to Abel and Cole, our prime competitor, and most of them will fall over. I mean, the one before Farm Drop was an example. I mean, they had millions, absolute millions on a tiny turnover. They were like spending 3 times as much on marketing as sales, but people kept on pumping money in, and they were going to disrupt everything and solve everything. And then they just, the investors got fed up in the end. And obviously some of them will be the next Google or X or whatever. And, will make a ton load of money, but...
Well, how have you found, and we don't have to go into exact numbers, but the mechanics of making those the recipe boxes work?
We just, they make a reasonable margin, but we really need to grow them to get into profit. We are a minnow in that marketplace. We were doing about 5,000 meals a week. I think it's probably something like that. And I think it just about washes its face, but in order to grow it, we would have to spend so much on marketing, because most of it, those customers are going to come online, and you're now paying so much for whatever words you're going to. We couldn't probably even afford to bid on our own name, because we would be outbid by Gusto or something. It's just a hideous. It's they have become the new shark landlords. That would have been, that you were paying your rent to, but now you're effectively paying it to these big tech companies, and it's pretty difficult. Sometimes it's quite difficult to just put your own name in and without paying, to actually have someone find you because there's so many people, bidding. And of course, these are monopolistic. They have achieved, what all the venture capitalists hope to achieve. They've got into a monopolistic position, which is just a complete, gravy train of generating.
They're not actually making any money. I don't understand how it. Well, I suppose if they flip it on, it doesn't matter, does it?
Well, they don't care, because they're hoping, and maybe they're hoping that it is going to be the next huge one, and they'll back 10, and I don't know what. I mean, I think they certainly expect 2/3 of them to fail. So that is just built into the model, which means that the one that succeeds has to make so much money to pay for all the others, and. I don't know, this is how it works. That's how you get funding for new ideas and so on. I mean, that's how our model works. I don't like it very much because it just leaves no space for the person who just patiently wants to build something based on doing something really well, giving a great service, great product or whatever. It's all about, it's all about exit plans and selling it on.
Let's wrap that up there.
Yeah.
I've absolutely loved that so much.